Westworld Wednesdays, Season 1, Episode 1, Part 2. I got my computer back up and running today after work, and so I have a short presentation. I mentioned last time that when I tried to do this video from my notes after watching Episode 1, it was like over 2 hours long, and it was a mess. So I'm trying to break up that mess into just a few smaller parts that are more manageable for the average person to get through, and that point to some interesting details that you might not hear in other Westworld reviews, particularly at the psychological level, citing people like Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard in this installment. So I was going to point to Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground and the idea he has there about, man is not a piano key. But instead I would like to just point you, if you're not familiar with Jordan Peterson, just look up Jordan Peterson's lecture on Dostoevsky and man as a piano key. And I think there's 10-minute clips out there that you can look to where he goes over that part. The gist of it is that, not that I'm going to do that lecture justice, but the gist of it is that Dostoevsky is arguing that man has free will. And even if it sort of reminds me of the argument that Agent Smith makes to Morpheus in The Matrix, Part 1, that man has free will, and so even if everything is provided to man, if all his needs and desires are met, he will feel the need to exercise his freedom, and he would destroy his world just to exercise that freedom. And Agent Smith sort of makes the point to Morpheus that in some of the early versions of The Matrix, the humans were given a sort of fantasy world where all their needs and wants were met. It was sort of like heaven, right? This paradise. But he said the people kept waking up. Now, he has a little bit of a different justification as to why people kept waking up. I think he mentioned that the human brain or consciousness sort of required suffering. And if it wasn't apparent or real, then the brain thought it was in a dream state and would try to wake itself up, something along those lines. But Dostoevsky has sort of a quasi-similar idea going on, that man has to exercise his free will. He has to have that freedom to be a man. And I'm sort of linking this in with the player piano idea here. And they introduced this really early on in the season. I think it's in the credits actually, and that's what I wanted to point out. That the player piano is very interesting because it is sort of one of our first mainstreamed mechanizations of what only a human artist could do otherwise before this came about. So before the player piano, it might have been thought that only a human being could play music, sophisticated things like piano pieces. But then came along the player piano, and all of a sudden this music could be played without the human being, without the human soul. And here's another picture. I think I have a few pictures of the player piano that they use. And they have the player piano represented in a couple of ways. They have this traditional type of player piano that you're familiar with, but then in Ford's office there is another piano set up there, and it's a regular piano. But the reason why I say it's a player piano is, well, he uses it as such because he has a host sitting there, and the host is only turned on and off to just play music for him. So again, he sort of replaced the human being with something with no free will, that's just mechanical, in order to play music that humans formerly played. So that's just a little bit about the player pianos that I thought was interesting. Of course, the player piano is sort of stuck in a loop, like you'll see in episode 1. The host talk about loops, or the engineers talk about the hosts being in loops. Dolores wakes up over and over again to sort of the same day where she has her routine. And that sort of is, I think it's also meant to make comparisons to our own life. We wake up, we sort of have our own loops we go into. We wake up, we eat, we shower, whatever. We go to work, we have our commutes. These are our loops. And now, just like the hosts get interrupted by people who have free will and who are conscious, do we also get sort of interrupted in the same way? And so as we watch this first episode, it's kind of jarring that how similar we are to these hosts. You know, on practically every level of analysis, we're the only thing you can say is that the host technically at this level is not self-aware, whereas we are self-aware. And now you can argue to what extent and so forth. Oh yeah, I just have another picture here. Yeah, so this is like the sort of the coding inside the machine, and you can see all the bits and pieces working. I think in that metaphor and epistemology video, I quoted Nietzsche saying, you know, does man ever see himself encased in a glass case with a spotlight on all his inner workings, sort of like this? That's what this reminds me of. That so man doesn't have that self-knowledge. As far as he knows the truth of things, he doesn't even know how his inner workings are working. He doesn't see the flow of his blood, or the air in his respiration, or his intestines entangled up inside of himself. And he can't even control, a lot of the, his heartbeat or his breathing. Well, his breathing to some extent, but, his inner processes, he can't even control. So again, it sort of reminds me of the mechanistic nature of man, if you think in those terms. And I think in our day and age, it's hard not to think in those terms. That's sort of how a modern mind has been trained to think. And these are some hands playing, I believe, in the opening scene. You have a host sitting down to play the piano. Again, this is a human act, but it's being done by a machine at the human level of playing. And this particular host does not yet have their skin, so it makes it even more horrific that the human is being replaced sort of by this unliving thing. And this is another shot of them about to play the piano. But here you can see the hands, I think, are being removed. So the host is removing his hands, and the piano yet still plays. The machine can still produce the music. Now, the other thing I wanted to touch on was this reading by Kierkegaard, although there is probably a lot more to say about this piano, about man being a piano key, having free will, and so forth, and having the desire to wake up. I think you could see this applies to later in the season, and I won't talk about spoilers, but if you've already seen the show in its entirety, then you'll see that this idea of man not being a piano key and wanting his freedom to get out of his loops and so forth, this definitely plays into the show. So, but I wanted to get into this reading by Kierkegaard, and I skipped the reading by Dostoevsky just because I thought it was too long. But this Kierkegaard reading, I think it's only 2.5 pages, barely, and it's really fitting for the show and for one particular character that maybe two characters maybe, but you'll see. So Kierkegaard says, this is from The Sickness Unto Death, a Christian psychological exposition for upbuilding and awakening. Quote, to lack infinitude is despairing reductionism, narrowness. Of course, what is meant here is only ethical narrowness and limitation. As a matter of fact, in the world there is interest only in intellectual or aesthetic limitation, or in the indifferent, in which there is the greatest interest in the world, for the secular mentality is nothing more or less than the attribution of infinite worth to the indifferent. The secular view always clings tightly to the difference between man, and naturally does not have any understanding of the one thing needful, for to have it is spirituality, and thus has no understanding of the reductionism and narrowness involved in having lost oneself, not by being volatilized in the infinite, but by being completely finitized, by becoming a number instead of a self, just one more man, just one more repetition of this everlasting one and the same. Despairing narrowness is to lack primitivity, or to have robbed oneself of one's primitivity, to have emasculated oneself in a spiritual sense. Every human being is primitively intended to be a self, destined to become himself, and as such every self certainly is angular, but that only means that it is to be ground into shape, not that it is to be ground down smooth, not that it is utterly to abandon being itself out of fear of men, or even simply out of fear of men not to dare to be itself in its more essential contingency, which definitely is not to be ground down smooth, in which a person is still himself for himself. But whereas one kind of despair plunges wildly into the infinite and loses itself, another kind of despair seems to permit itself to be tricked out of itself by the others, quote unquote. Surrounded by hordes of men, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world, such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, does not dare to believe in himself, finds it too hazardous to be himself, and far easier and safer to be like the others, to become a copy, a number, a mass man. Now, I'm just going to take a slight break here to interject who I might be talking about, because I know that the first part of that is kind of tough to get through, and some of Kierkegaard is, of course, like your standard philosophical text. But I think now we're starting to break free from the philosophical text and into something that's more understandable. And so, especially, that last sentence, such a person forgets himself, forgets his name divinely understood, and so it doesn't believe in himself, and so forth. Because he is too, what does it say? Surrounded by hordes of men, absorbed in all sorts of secular matters, more and more shrewd about the ways of the world. So who does that remind you of in this series? And, if you've only watched the first episode, perhaps you don't know, but it's not too much of a spoiler to say that the man who knows so much about, Westworld and about the world in general, who has forgotten himself, I think I have a picture. Ah, yes, it's this. This is sort of why I put this up here. It's the man in black. And I think this quote is definitely applicable to him. And I'm going to read on this. The second part of the quote is definitely more understandable than the first part. And you can see exactly why the proportions of man, as I show on the screen here, is applicable. Now this is back to Kierkegaard. Now this form of despair goes practically unnoticed in the world. Just by losing himself this way, such a man has gained an increasing capacity for going along superbly in business and social life, indeed for making a great success in the world. Here there is no delay, no difficulty with his self and its infinitizing. He is as smooth as a rolling stone, as current, passable, as a circulating coin. He is so far from being regarded as a person in despair that he is just what a human being is supposed to be. As is natural, the world generally has no understanding of what is truly appalling. The despair that not only does not cause one any inconvenience in life, but makes life cozy and comfortable, is in no way, of course, regarded as despair. That this is the world's view is borne out, for example, by practically all the proverbs, which are nothing more than rules of prudence. For example, we say that one regrets 10 times for having spoken to once for having kept silent. And why? Because the external fact of having spoken can involve one in difficulties, since it is an actuality. But to have kept silent, and yet this is the most dangerous of all. For by maintaining silence, a person is thrown wholly upon himself. Here actuality does not come to his aid by punishing him, by heaping the consequences of his speaking upon him. No, in this respect it is easy to keep silent. But the person who knows what is genuinely appalling fears most of all any mistake, any sin that takes an inward turn and leaves no outward trace. The world considers it dangerous to venture in this way. And why? Because it is possible to lose. Not to venture is prudent, and yet, precisely by not venturing, it is so terribly easy to lose what would be hard to lose, however much one lost by risking, and in any case, never this way so easily, so completely, as if it were nothing at all, namely, oneself. If I have ventured wrongly, well then, life helps me by punishing me. But if I have not ventured at all, who helps me then? Moreover, what if by not venturing at all, in the highest sense, and to venture in the highest sense is precisely to become aware of oneself, I cowardly gain all earthly advantages, and lose myself? So it is with finitude's despair. Because a man is in this kind of despair, he can very well live on in temporality, indeed, actually all the better, can appear to be a man, be publicly acclaimed, honored, and esteemed, be absorbed in all the temporal goals. In fact, what is called the secular mentality consists simply of such men who, so to speak, mortgage themselves to the world. They use their capacities, amass money, carry on secular enterprises, calculate shrewdly, etc., perhaps make a name in history, but themselves they are not. Spiritually speaking, they have no self for whose sake they could venture everything, no self before God, however self-seeking they are otherwise. Now, I think Jordan Peterson goes over that part too at some point in his lecture series, but I don't remember exactly. But I remember, reading this book in college, and that was just extremely powerful. It spoke to me. And if you're watching this series, I just want to bring it back into your life, if maybe you've heard it before or maybe it's new to you. And think about it with regard to this guy here, the Man in Black, as far as we know him in Season 1, Episode 1. And if you're familiar with the series in its entirety, that quote makes even more sense than if you've just seen Episode 1, Season 1. I think that's all I have time for tonight. But, again, I hope to put out a couple of more installments to this Episode 1 psychological sort of review of Westworld. And if you are interested in this, please like and subscribe. Thank you.